Today's video is brought to you by Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout has helped over 100,000 people start their own podcast. It's the easiest way to host, promote, and track your podcast. Start your free 90-day trial today at buzzsprout.com. What does it take to launch a podcast, especially going into 2021? Good thing you're watching this video because I'm going to launch my own podcast, and I don't want to walk you through every step of the process that I take to launch a podcast. That's all coming up next.
Podcasting, training and development.
Hey there, podcaster. My name is the Shan Man, radio broadcaster, podcaster, podcast producer, and now a podcast therapist, evidently. And in today's video, we are going to show you how to create a podcast and get it ready for launch or release in 2021. What is that going to take? Now, this video and another video that I have created, this is actually a project that I have been working on for the past couple of months and just preparing and getting everything ready. So I want to walk you through what my process is of launching my own podcast. I've done this in the past before, but this one has been a little more intentional, with a lot of intention behind every step of the process that I am creating here. So what I have done is that I have written everything down inside my Rocket book. And of course, I want to read to you every step that I have in this process. And then in another video, a follow-up video, we're going to go really in depth and deep with this process of getting everything into a hosting provider, okay? So that's just what you should be expecting with this particular video. So let's start with the idea of what it is that I am going to be creating. So as you might have figured out by now, I don't know if you have, but the last couple of videos that I have done, except for last video, I missed a week last week because I was working on this particular series of videos, was that I wanted to create a podcast all based around this new name that I have been mentioning in my podcast called The Podcast Therapist. And as I mentioned, it was someone who gave me that nickname, and I thought, that's a really good idea for a podcast. There have been podcasts in the past where, there was Cliff Ravenscraft, where he had the podcast Answer Man, and then that podcast, he's been doing something else outside of podcasting. But I figured, why not Podcast Therapist? There are a number of podcast coaches out there that are helping people get podcasts into, syndication platforms and producing the podcasts themselves. But what I have found with this channel is that I listen to a lot of podcast questions and the problems and the hangups that they're experiencing, and me walking people through those steps. And so that's why I decided, let's go ahead and go with the Podcast Therapist. So that was the first idea of the genesis of the idea was from someone I helped out, and then she named me that, and then I thought, well, this is where I really want to take this podcast. So the next step that really went into that process was that, okay, I needed to figure out the branding. So let's start there. Let's start with the branding of the podcast. And when it comes down to branding, you're going to have, in my eyes, three specific types of branding. You're going to have audio branding, you're going to have visual branding, and you're going to have website branding. And I'll break down each one and which ones, what they mean for everyone, okay? So first, let's start with website branding. I think this is one that kind of has to be very important for you, especially if you're going to create a podcast that is revolving around the name. But there are going to be ways that you can get around this if you can't find specific names that will match up with maybe a domain name that you're looking for. So that's what I want to get to. So if you have a podcast name, what I would do is I would search it out, do some research on the podcast name itself, and look it up inside of Apple Podcasts, and see if you can find podcasts that have the same name. Do some Google searches, and if you find a name that does not exist, what I would do is I would go and I would look to find the domain name and buy it. So in this case, we have the Podcast Therapist, and before I let anyone know about this, I went out and I purchased the domain name. Now, for me, I already have my own website. Now, this could present kind of a problem later down the line, but what I ended up doing is I purchased the domain name itself through Rebrandly. So I took the link shortener of Rebrandly, and now I can have any link that is on my website at theshanman.com and have it masked and put inside of thepodcasttherapist.com. So anytime I mention a thepodcasttherapist.com/whatever it may be, that is going to redirect back to my Shanman website. So that was the intention behind that. Maybe at one point in time, I will have the Podcast Therapist website, but since my website is already all about podcasting, who knows, maybe I'll transfer the domain name over to the Podcast Therapist. Right now, that's just not something that I have to do, okay? So I've got the domain name, the Podcast Therapist, and I own the domain name. And the links that I will be sharing in the actual podcast itself will point to specific pages on that page. So make sure you find the right name so that you can brand it, okay? The next step that you're going to need to take is that you're going to have some visual branding itself. So the visual branding is obviously going to be the show art for itself. So this is where you're going to have to take the steps of either doing it yourself. You can do it through Canva, maybe Adobe Illustrator if you want, or you're just going to Fiverr. All right. So you're taking the name of the actual podcast and you're having someone do something with it, with some cool fonts, with some cool artwork. I don't know what it may be. Maybe it's a picture of you cut out and then there is a field of flowers in the background. And then you're like the podcast, I don't know, yoga inspiration expert. I don't know what it may be. So that might be something that you're doing, and you might need to hire someone out through Fiverr. 99 Designs, I believe has designers as well. It might cost you a little more. For me, in this particular section, I had an idea of what I was kind of looking for. There was maybe this idea, and it might possibly still happen with artwork, where I grabbed my glasses and then I got a cardigan and then I sat in a chair with a pipe, and then that could have been the artwork, but I thought that might have been a little too kitschy. I really decided to stick with what I wanted to do, okay, with who I was. And of course, I'm in radio. I work with big mixing boards. I work with audio all the time. And so the artwork that I decided to go ahead and create went through a few different iterations, okay? So what you're going to see on your screen right here is actually the podcast artwork that we're looking to submit into the Apple Podcast store. So that is what we're going to be doing. That's going to be put into our hosting provider, okay? Now, one thing when it comes down to your visual branding is that some podcasters don't tend to think about other platforms ahead of time. And so what I think is important that you do is that you create not only your show art, but you are also creating other pieces of artwork that will matter. So it's going to mean that you might need to create a Facebook cover page, okay, for your page or maybe for your group. So you need to consider creating those. Your artwork for your podcast, which is going to be the square, is going to be 3,000 by 3,000. Your Facebook artwork is going to be some different dimensions, all right? So when you're asking someone to design something, you are wanting to look for the podcast cover art. You're going to be looking for the Facebook page cover art, maybe the Twitter page cover art. And then there might be some other pieces of cover art that you're looking for. I have written down here, Facebook, Twitter, maybe an Instagram square. I don't know. And just save those and have them ready, okay? So those are the three things that you will also need to create. So it's just not show art. You need to also create these other images, SEO art as well. So maybe when I say SEO, it's going to be the search engine optimization image that will show up when someone shares your podcast onto social media. So you need to have that one. I know the dimensions of that one exactly. It's 1280 by 720. So just know those are the dimensions that you need to have. Next, you need to have some audio branding. And this is where it's really going to depend on whether or not you want to have an audio brand for yourself. Some will call this sound design. Others will call it audio branding. I just happen to call it sound design and audio branding itself. And what exactly is it? Now, sound design and audio branding may be the intro to your podcast. It's the intro that's, it's got some music, and then you have a voiceover artist say like, thank you so much for calling, or thank you so much for listening to the Red Curtains podcast. I'm just looking at my curtains. The Red Curtains podcast with your host, Seth Meyers. I don't know. Could be someone else. And, the podcast where we teach you how to do blank, 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 trim long curtains. I don't know what it may be. All right. So that's what you're going to create. Those are very simple and basic sound brands. For me, because I work in radio, I like to have a sound design and sound brand to be more unique so that it is a little more memorable. So as you will hear in this particular podcast, whenever it does drop, you're going to hear that it has elements that fit more of my style and my brand. Does this mean that you got to do it exactly how I do it? No, you don't have to do it exactly the way I do it. You could do it your own way. You could do it how traditional podcasts do it. It's just going to depend on the genre and your audience of how you're going to want them to perceive you. All right. So mine tends to be a little more active. I tend to be a little bit more of an outgoing person, outgoing introvert, really. But that is really where I want to take this particular podcast. I want it to be a little more active, and I want people to get more information. So those are the three things in branding that I needed to focus on. Each one took its own amount of time. The visual branding took about, I'd say 2 or 3 days for me to come up with that artwork because I really wanted to marinate over the design. The audio branding took about 3 or 4 days for me to design on my own. So you don't have to, you can pay for someone, but at some point I want to teach people how to do this on their own so that they can do it on their own, so they don't have to pay someone to do this. And then the website branding, that took me, finding the name, and that took me probably about, within minutes, took me less than an hour to do. Okay. So those are the elements that you need with everything. Okay. So audio branding, visual branding, and you need website branding itself. Now, once you have all those pieces together, you need to start collecting them, putting them in some folders on your computer, and have those ready to go. It is best to have all of that stuff ready to go because it can be a big headache later down the line. You don't want to be rushing to anything. You don't want to be rushing to get the artwork out and then you have a deadline, all right? Just get it all collected and ready to go. I have it in a folder on my external hard drive. It's ready to go. I have it saved in the cloud as well. The next step that you'll want to take is that you're going to want to start recording. So we already have gone over this topic of equipment, and we already have gone over this topic of which equipment that you need. You can get equipment that has, a mixing board with a microphone, or you can just go as simple as using an AT2100X USB microphone. That might be just as simple as you go, and you're just doing Zoom calls, StreamYard calls. It just, that's really what you're going to be looking to do. All right. As you will hear in my particular podcast interviews, I'm using my mixing board. I'm using this Shure SM7B microphone, and I did my interviews, or I'm doing my interviews on StreamYard, and there's specific ways in which I am recording those. I have a video on how to record Zoom calls with higher quality audio that I'll leave in the description, or maybe up here in the I'll leave it over here in the card on YouTube, so you can find those videos as well. So I'll try to leave as many links for you to make this process a lot easier. Okay. So you want to jump in and you want to start recording your podcast. Now, what do you need as far as episodes are concerned? How many episodes do you need? What type of episodes do you need? Well, let's start with what type of episodes do you need? Do you need to have, full length episodes that are really, really long, or do you need to just have really short episodes? Well, to get started, what I did is I started with a trailer. I created a very simple trailer that is about 2 minutes long, and it described exactly what my podcast was going to be about. So I talked about it being the podcast therapist, how I'm a radio broadcaster, and I want to bridge the gap between radio broadcasting and radio broadcasting and podcasting itself. And I go into a little more depth about who I am. I give a little bit of a credence to who I am as a broadcaster and what I can do to help the podcasting community. So I have this one episode that is 2 minutes long, and it's a trailer. That's it. That's all I have. Okay. Then what I ended up doing for this particular podcast, you are going to see that I have a couple of utility episodes. And what utility episodes are for me is that they're going to be super evergreen pieces of content. They're going to share with people how to get a podcast started. Now, because this video I am sharing with you right now is going to be on YouTube, I have an audio version of whatever is going on over on my website where the podcast is going to be hosted. But I start from the very beginning. I start with the reasons of why I'm using certain pieces of equipment. I give more justification behind the reasons why I use these pieces of equipment. Doesn't mean that you have to get these pieces of equipment. It just shares with you my thoughts on the equipment. The first episode is actually pretty decently long. I mean, it's about 75 minutes, but it's really intended for the beginning podcaster. So when you go in and you create your content, where are you going to start? Well, it depends on the genre that you're in. If you're doing a comedy podcast, maybe you want to do a quick trailer about what the podcast is going to be about. And then the next episode that you're going to record, maybe what that needs to be is more of an introduction of your style of podcasting, or maybe you just jump right in to the podcast content itself. It's really all going to depend on what you want to do. But I would make a point to really introduce myself and get the audience warmed up to who I am as a podcaster. That's really kind of the point. I prefer to share value in my podcast episodes. Maybe I share too much value. Maybe I share too much fluff. I don't know. Just know that you're going to find your groove whenever you get involved with your podcast. So once you find that groove, then it's going to be a lot easier and more simple. Okay. Now we have 3 episodes, and then I've recorded a couple of interviews that we're going to be putting out there, and I need to start setting the tone. I need to start setting the schedule out. So I'm going to start figuring out what the schedule is going to be like. Am I going to put these podcasts out on Tuesdays? Am I going to put them out on Wednesdays? Am I going to put them out Fridays? Maybe. I don't know. We're going to figure that out as we go along. So it's really going to depend. I just want to make sure that I have episodes showing up in Apple Podcasts. Okay. So once I have recorded all of my podcast episodes, I want to take them in and I want to start editing them. I edit them in my own DAW, which is Adobe Audition. That's my preferred DAW of choice. You're going to hear a podcast where I talk about why I use Adobe Audition. There are some things that I can share inside of a podcast that I cannot share inside of a YouTube video. With podcasting, I can share in depth of why I use these programs. And so with a YouTube video, it's a little bit different. I can't share too much, or I could share a lot, but we all know that it's a visual platform. I would much rather have people in an area where they are listening, doing, some other extracurricular activity, whether that be cooking, cleaning, walking, exercising, whatever it may be. And it gives them a reason why they should be listening to that podcast. It's almost like active passive listening, if you ask me. But I want to set all these podcast episodes or these pieces of recordings up in my DAW and edit them out and set up the templates to have them produced and mixed down and ready to save into my hard drives. So that is where I'm going to end today's episode. I'm going to release a follow-up episode to this particular video. I can't decide whether or not I want to release it on the same day or if I want to release it in a different day, but just know that there's a follow-up episode, and that one is going to be coming, and it's going to talk about how to get your podcast up into the podcast app stores, into the syndication platforms, and it's very in depth with how we are going to be doing this. So be on the lookout for that one. These episodes that I'm sharing with you, I have not shared these on my particular YouTube channel in the past before. So just know that these are episodes that are really going to be valuable for you, because the second episode or the second video to this one is going to walk you through all the steps, reasons, and why I am choosing the particular podcast platform to host my audio. So if you like this video, go ahead and leave it a thumbs up, and of course hit the subscribe button down below on this particular YouTube video, and hit the little bell button down below as well to get notified if I decide to drop the same this follow-up video on another day, or maybe on the same day. But either way, get those notifications, because that's when I drop brand new videos. And I'm going to be dropping a lot more content with people that I have interviewed for the Podcast Therapist. So tell me what you think. Is this your process to setting up a podcast? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are down below. What steps did you take to set up your own podcast, especially as we jump into 2021? I'd love to hear your processes and see what it takes to get a podcast up in 2021. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching this week. I really appreciate it. I'll be talking to you next time.